office and what happens in the hour before you see the client emerge out of the lawyer's office after the initial interview. This brings us to the last part of our program today, which is headed Dealing with the Family Law Client. And we're very privileged indeed to have with us today Barbara Irving, Master of Social Work. Barbara was with the Puntley Youth Services from October of '65 until November of 1974. In clinical experience with teenagers and their families through individual, group, and family treatment, and she also was supervising Bachelor of Social Work students in the Puntley Youth Services. From September of 1974 through May of 1975, she was teaching a course in group process at George Brown College, and from January of 1975 until now, she's been in private practice in individual, marital, and family counseling. Barbara's really a friend of the Law Society. She's participated in many of our programs with great effect. She's a clinical member of the Ontario Association of Marriage and Family Counselors, as well as a member of the Ontario Association of Professional Social Workers. And as I indicated to you before this morning, Barbara's been very active in doing mediation of difficult custody and access questions, and as far as I'm concerned, I think she's a miracle worker. So it gives me great pleasure to present Barbara Irving to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I was going to say that my magic wand is a little bit rusty. Sometimes when I have clients in my office, I wish I were a little bit more of a miracle worker. I'm genuinely pleased to be part of the continuing education program of Family Law for Legal Secretaries, because this represents to me, and I think to everybody here, a true recognition of the importance of you all too frequently unsung heroines and a couple of heroes I saw in the audience, who are really on the front lines. It really says something about your impact on the family law process. A great deal has been said and written about the role of judges and lawyers, and quite recently about counselors in dealing with the family law client, but much too little has been said about your role. Last week, when I mentioned to a lawyer that I was planning to speak to you today, he told me that he had recently realized that his secretary was screening his calls, deciding which ones would reach him, and a lot of other important business, thereby exercising a great deal of power in the way his practice developed. She also sets the emotional tone in his office, he says, as she is the client's first and most frequent contact with the lawyer. By the way, this lawyer that I was speaking to didn't seem the least bit upset about it, and he obviously had a great deal of confidence in his secretary. And I may say as an aside that I sat at a table with some very interesting women, and a couple of them were telling me about what was going on in their offices, and it became very clear to me that this lawyer is not alone. There was one woman who has a young lawyer, and she was telling me how he needs confidence, and she makes sure he gets it. And I think this is very important. I'm a person who deals in behavior all the time and feelings, and I know that that's what counts. Whether he makes it in court or not may have a lot to do about with how much support he got in his office. While the lawyer that I was talking to last week about it recognized the heaviness of the workload of his legal secretary and the pressures of time and deadlines under which she frequently works, what he probably didn't recognize was the emotional squeeze that she is frequently in. I hope the two gentlemen will, who are enrolled today will pardon me for using she. All of you know those emotional squeezes between the demands of the client and those of the lawyer himself, who's also dealing with great pressures. Now, dealing with your lawyer is a whole other subject. It's a very fascinating one. But it unfortunately isn't the focus of today's topic, which is the family law client. The problems of family law clients are essentially ones of human relations in their most intense and complex form. Despite the headlines in popular magazines, which tout creative divorce as if it were a PhD or a necessary milestone on the road to maturity or a status symbol to prove how liberated you are, those of us who deal regularly with family law clients feel the impact of the incredible pain that this involves. Family law litigation is unique among all legal actions in that it is almost invariably accompanied by the most intense and intimate of human emotions. It is rarely a cut and dried piece of business with a clear-cut beginning and end, which can be handled and filed away. And we again had a discussion at the table at lunchtime about the differences between secretaries who work for real estate firms and those in family law. And of course, because this is a little bit of a skewed sample here today, the real estate was considered not as interesting. The pain in the process can't help but filter right through the ranks, through the lawyer, and of course, through the legal secretary. When the psychological factors that affect the situation are not dealt with throughout the whole divorce process, the resulting complications come back to plague the lawyer and thus the legal secretary again and again. Bitter acrimony around child custody and visitation, non-payment of support, and alimony. The list is all too familiar to all of you. The retention of fault grounds and the psychological impact of the adversary system results in actual practice in pitting the marital couple against each other in mortal combat. Now, I'm pleased to see, I think we began to see on this tape, that these two lawyers were going to try to get the couple to mediate. Unfortunately, too many lawyers who don't have a family law orientation do not do that. This kind of adversary system intensifies the emotional trauma that already exists in most cases. The reconciliation clause in the 1968 Divorce Act indicated an awareness on the part of the legislators that the human issues in family breakdown needed to be dealt with. But the lawyer, both by dint of his role in divorce litigation and his adversarial orientation, is not able to counsel clients. The lawyer and the counselor frequently function in opposite ways. The neutrality required of the marriage counselor is at odds with the character of the lawyer. Legal training is calculated to promote close reasoning and argumentation in favor of a partisan interest, in short, to develop the art of advocacy. On the other hand, marriage counseling requires a nonpartisan approach to the total family situation. Where advice giving is the lawyer's basic technique, communication and interaction skills are the marriage counselor's forte. The lawyer acts for the client. The marriage counselor tries to help the client to act for himself. The lawyer deals with acts, and the marriage counselor deals with emotions. Now, it should be noted again that in family law, these lines are getting more and more blurred, but obviously the lawyer has to maintain a very different stance from a marriage counselor. While lawyers who deal with personal injury cases are taught what they need to know about medicine, family lawyers who are constantly dealing with the rawest of family emotions are more often than not taught nothing about human behavior. The same holds for legal secretaries, of course. Yet lawyers and legal secretaries are expected to deal with people in extreme, severe emotional crisis. Because of not knowing where else to turn, or because of pride, or not wanting anyone else to know their problems, many clients tend to seek out lawyers first when their marriages are faltering. It's not uncommon for a client to approach a lawyer for a divorce, knowing full well that he has no intentions of going through it. Such clients use the threat of divorce to control their spouse's behavior. Frequently, clients do think perhaps they will get a divorce when they don't know themselves, in fact, that they couldn't go through the process. This is something that needs to be picked up by the lawyer. Obviously, if such clients are not helped to examine their behavior, the lawyer and the legal secretary may well be involved repeatedly and with a very high annoyance factor in an area which is not appropriate for them to deal with. When the pain, guilt, and bitterness is not dealt with, the unresolved desire for revenge too often motivates seemingly endless litigation around child custody and so forth. In many cases, the end of divorce proceedings merely marks the beginning of legal problems. We all know the family law clients. They cry, they shout, they call again and again, they call late at night, they call early in the morning. I'm sure that each of you could add to anecdotes. Any anecdotes that I could give you, I'm sure you could give me one in return about how people behave under stress. The most successful way of helping the client to become aware of his frequently irrational behavior, to provide an outlet for these intense emotions, and to begin to deal with the feelings that inevitably accompany and frequently undermine the legal process, is to refer him for counseling. But since you are the ones who frequently deal with the strongest impact of the client's emotions, you have the responsibility to feed back your impressions of the client's need to your lawyers. And by the way, I'm not forgetting that you're probably waiting to learn some concrete ways of dealing with a family law client, as it's said in the program. But I would first like to describe briefly what counseling is and is not. Marriage counseling differs from psychiatric treatment in that no deep personality change is attempted, although I must say that many of us who are dealing with family law clients frequently wish that we could change their personality. Also in marital counseling, no drugs are administered. That would be strictly a psychiatric area. Marriage counseling is a therapeutic process through which the counselor provides an atmosphere in which the marital pair is free to bring out and examine openly their pain and their disappointment with regard to their own and their spouse's failure to fulfill their expectations. This is frequently a revelation for each spouse, because many people are totally unaware of what their mate expects in a marriage. Frequently when people get married, they think, we're in love, he knows what I think. Unfortunately, our heads are not made of glass, that people can't see through us, and unless we continue open communication, there's no way of knowing what people expect of each other. Frequently we fall in love with an ideal, and it's not the other partner's fault that he doesn't live up to it when he has no way of knowing what it is, and vice versa. The way I work is to see each spouse at least once alone. There are 3 reasons for seeing people alone in my mind. One is that frequently there's a third party involved that the other spouse may not know about and may not have to at this point. And my personal bias about third parties, as an aside, and I think it was touched on this morning, is that in all the years that I've been doing this, I have never seen a third party destroy a marriage. It's true that a third party is very important. A third party will frequently introduce people to themselves at a time when they're feeling very low, very down, very unloved, and unlovable in every way. Somebody comes along who gives them all those feelings, and it's very important. But I do not feel that people are open to an ongoing love affair unless there's something really basically missing in the marriage. I still feel, maybe it's very old-fashioned, that people still value marriage too much to be as casual as it appears in the media that they are. And the pain that I feel in my office, which is sometimes you can almost feel it as a physical presence, certainly adds to that feeling that I have, that it's not easy to get out of a marriage. I don't think anyone does it easily. After I see people, I was telling you why I see them separately. Another reason is there are things about your spouse that you don't feel free to say in front of him or her because you feel that you'll get it in the neck afterwards if you do. And it's important for me to know, of course. But the main reason that I see people separately is to find out how each person perceives the marriage. Frequently, 2 people have been living together for 15 or 20 years, each one seeing the marriage in a different way. I will go through the same history. Sometimes the facts of the history aren't even the same. And it isn't that anyone's lying. It's simply that people see things differently. And of course, you build your behavior on your perceptions. So then I see them together. I ask people to agree to 4 interviews together. I ask for 4 because in the first 2 or 3, usually nothing but negatives comes out. It's almost like emptying a garbage pail. Until all the negatives are out on the surface, we can't really get to any building. By 4 interviews, we all have a pretty good idea where we're going, where the strengths are, and where the weaknesses are. The goals of marriage counseling are to help the client gain enough insight into his own marital and family problems to have a realistic idea of how severe they are and how possible change is, and to support the clients and activate whatever emotional resources they have towards making the decisions and accepting the responsibilities which are inevitably involved in either trying to make the marriage work or getting out of it in as constructive a way as possible. It should be noted that marriage counseling, as I see it, should be really renamed conciliation counseling, as opposed to reconciliation or divorce counseling, because the goals range really on a continuum from reconciliation at one extreme, where both spouses want it, or even when one wants it very much, to help in disengaging from the marriage at the other end. That would be sort of in the divorce area. And then there's a whole span in between. It's an area which I call limbo counseling, which is probably one of the most painful areas and what you see in your office all the time, where one wants in and the other wants out of the marriage, which is a very painful, difficult area. Okay. The other thing that I should say is that there's no way of knowing when a client comes into my office how the marriage is going to go. Frequently, people come in just for a 40,000-mile checkup. Things are okay, and they just few little things they want to check. Really, there is no energy left in the marriage, and there's just nothing to work with. As far as hope for a marriage, usually the couples who hate each other are better off as far as working on something, because at least there's energy moving. I've had couples who came in only under duress because lawyers insisted they do around custody or access, and they walk out hand in hand, arm in arm, and at one point, one couple was almost arrested on the front lawn of our office, getting very, very friendly after an interview. The manner in which each couple uses marriage counseling depends upon their emotional capacity for change. In other words, the personality that they brought to the marriage initially. It also is involved with the point of time at which they come, how long it's been going on. Frequently, we see one spouse who has really turned off emotionally years before, has been emotionally divorced for many years before they reach either a lawyer or counseling. And finally, how motivated they are to work on their problems. I've done a fair amount of counseling with the Mormon Church, and some of the marriages are just terrible, but the motivation is so strong that somehow they have made things work where other people haven't. So that's a very large factor. In those cases where the couple decides after joint counseling that divorce is the appropriate course of action for them, it then becomes feasible to see the clients individually, to help each examine his new role and adapt to his new lifestyle. This individual counseling is also most helpful in cases where reconciliation is a definite impossibility from the outset. There's frequently depression, anxiety, and fear of being alone to be dealt with. I call this exorcising ghosts. Until people are free of the spouse, they are never really free to go on to other relationships. Just because someone is legally separated or even divorced does not mean that they are emotionally separated or divorced. We know from studies that people frequently, most often, think about separating for 2 years before they approach a lawyer. So the process has started way back, and my experience in my office has been that it goes on for a good 2 years after the point of separation, until people can actually see each other and say, yeah, that's a nice person, we had some nice things together, and let the anger go. Until that point, anytime there's dating, people are always either looking for the opposite trait or the same trait as in their former spouse, which is not dealing with people as people, it's dealing with them as compared to the ghost. In fact, we can compare the separation process to the process that people go through in mourning a death. It is the death of a relationship. And we know from studies that in death, people go through 4 stages. The first one is denial. This isn't happening. This can't be happening to me. The second is anger. Why me? What did I ever do to deserve it? The third is depression, which we all know and love. And finally, in a death, there's acceptance. But unlike the finality of death, in divorce or separation, the spouse is very much alive and frequently very visible around children and around other men or women. And so the mourning process is reactivated and goes on and on. It may go on in different order, but it continues. If that isn't dealt with, it can develop into what Richard Gardner, who's a New York psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Boys and Girls Book About Divorce. He was in Toronto a few months ago to talk about conciliation. And he said that he sees what he calls divorce neurosis, or even psychosis, which is hanging on to anger. And all of you have had people in your offices who do that. It becomes a vendetta. And to me, what I say to these clients is that they think they're angry and they think they hate the spouse. In fact, they're hanging on through anger. It's a way of maintaining contact, of never letting go. Marriage counseling is very much reality-oriented. The focus should be on interaction between the spouses rather than on a deep intrapsychic phenomena. The focus is on the here and now and the future rather than dredging up old emotional wounds, other than whatever is actively operating today. I don't want to sound as naive as to say that what happened in the past isn't active today. It certainly is. But the focus is to deal with what's happening now and go on from here. Now, when I get a referral from a lawyer, I want to know in the beginning whether it's open or closed mediation. That is, closed mediation is the lawyers agree that whatever comes out in my office in counseling will not be used in any proceedings. Open mediation is that anything that comes out can be used. Lawyers referring cases to me know that I don't work for either lawyer, that I call it as I see it. When there are children involved, I see myself as the child's advocate and deal with the parents in relation to how they are affecting the children. There are, however, some very tangible goals that can aid the legal process that should be noted. A major cause of pain in most divorces is that seldom are both parties at the same level of readiness to leave the marriage at the point that one consults a lawyer. Most commonly, one has left or is about to leave, and the other party feels rejected and abandoned. The rejected spouse, who's unable to accept the fact that his partner will really go through with the divorce, is frequently willing to agree to almost anything in the vain hope that this will bring the spouse back. Frequently, the rejected party is too traumatized by the realization of his spouse actually leaving to figure out what his financial needs really will be in the future. Sometimes he's so depressed that he accepts inadequate financial arrangements just to get the whole procedure over and done with. Guilt also plays havoc with divorce proceedings. Sometimes the party who is leaving is so guilt-ridden that he agrees either to pay an unreasonably high amount of maintenance or to accept an unreasonably low amount. Eventually, the resentment rises to the surface and would result in further litigation if this were not cleared up. Then revenge rears its ugly head all too frequently. It's typical for the spurned spouse, who may see himself as having been made to suffer all sorts of indignities, to seek revenge in the form of money, or much worse, by using the children as a means of punishing the spouse or getting even with him. Children are always the casualty of their parents' marital battles. They so often become pawns in the struggle. Parents frequently use their children to solve their own bruised egos, or they vie for the children's favor, thus forcing the children into a conflict of loyalties, which more often than not results in permanent debilitating effects on their developing personalities. Even when parents are aware of these dangers and make a conscious effort to prevent them, and most of the parents I see certainly do, their own high level of anxiety throughout this entire process certainly damages their parenting abilities. At the time that the children are the most upset and need the parents the parents are the most upset themselves and the least able to give to the children. Post-divorce depression, which was discussed before, can last for a considerable period of time. Naturally, the children will be affected. The counselor's expertise lies in dealing with just such family interaction. The vital importance of involving the children at certain points in the process is obvious. Now, at this point of time in my practice, I've been doing a great deal of custody and access work. There are certain patterns that appear over and over with children. One is that children almost always feel that they are the cause of the marital breakdown, even when they have nothing to do with it and neither parent has ever implied it. Kids will somehow feel, if only I hadn't been bad, if only I had behaved, this kind of thing. And that is a terrible burden for kids to carry. Most parents would have no way of knowing that children feel this way, and most children don't talk openly about it. Unless this is brought up, there's no way of us finding out about it. The other thing that children immediately feel is if parents no longer love each other, if love is such an amorphous, cloud-like thing that can disappear, then maybe the love that the parents have for them will also disappear in the same way, which is very logical. How do we tell children, when we don't really understand it so much ourselves, that the love between a man and a woman is different than the love between parents and children? That parents are forever. It's very hard, especially when one or the other spouse is involved with a third party, and the spouse who isn't involved says, your mother doesn't love you, she left and ran away with some man, which is frequently what kids are dealing with. I don't want to take too much time. There's so many things I could talk about. I'm kind of torn here about what I do in trying to mediate in these custody and access situations. Basically, I have found that that kind of counseling is very different from marital counseling. Briefly, I can say that I'm much more authoritarian in custody and access mediation. I tell parents, look, you are really hurting your kids. You say you care for your kids, then let's see you act accordingly. I give them lots of time to deal with their anger, but I'm pretty straight about the effect that it has on them. Sometimes a person who's not their lawyer, who's telling them that, makes a big difference. I also do things like set up some schedules that are quite rigid. If the parents can't get along, I set it up so that they have absolutely no contact. I tell the children in front of both parents that neither parent is to ask what happens when the child is with the other parent. If mom asks about dad, did his girlfriend come? Did he have a new car? All that kind of thing. If the father asks anything about the mother, or the mother asks anything about the father, children are to call me. Now, this is a very extreme way of handling it. Obviously, I try to mediate and help things work in an amicable fashion. If they can't, this is the kind of thing I've done. The result of that is that the child is taken off the firing line. It then becomes a matter of me dealing with the parents. If the father is questioning about the mother, the child doesn't tell the mother. Obviously, that would start a big scene. The child calls me, and I deal with it. Almost never have I had to deal with it. As soon as the parents know that big bad Barbara Irving is in, my name is always being used in vain. Even in marital counseling where the children are involved, people will say, we got into bed and we had the biggest fight about you. I'm always being, my name is used in vain in a lot of beds in the city. In custody cases, as I say, I try everything possible. And as the years go on and I get older and wiser, I'm less sure of anything. I know that when you're dealing with people, anything that works is great. I've gone through all the wonderful theories, and if they don't work, I resort to what I call the Jewish mother, King Solomon approach, which is a guilt approach. I say that not putting anyone down, since I come from a long line of Jewish mothers myself. I feel safe about saying that. What I do literally is say to a couple, after as much counseling as I think was useful, okay, you both say you care for this child or these children. Now we've done everything and it's been unsuccessful. Now it's left up to a judge. Do you know that your child or your children feel that you are abandoning them? Their whole future depends on what some judge who doesn't know them at all, has never laid eyes on them, says about them. Are you going to abandon your child? And that's what the children say to me. They say they care. My mother and father say they care for me. yet they're going to let a total stranger decide my fate. And even little kids say it obviously in other words. And I say that to parents. That's how your child feels. If there's any hope of you doing anything, this is it. And frequently at that point, when I bring them together and lay that trip on them, there's been a lot of parents crying and being very upset and then finally coming to some kind of resolution. And at that point, when they're very emotional, I use that time to say, we'll work on improving the relationships in the family so that it won't continue to be like this. Sometimes it doesn't work. And then, of course, we have the safety of the court system, which we need at that time. A major but not always successful goal of counseling is to help the couple become rational and responsible enough to cooperate. Well, I think I've sort of covered that. Obviously, voluntary settlements, which are worked out by both spouses on an emotional as well as an intellectual level, are much more humane than those forced by litigation, and also more practical. You can't legislate human emotions, as any lawyer knows, and as any legal secretary knows who has typed one complaint after another, one affidavit after another. Mutual agreement means that neither party is the loser or has been taken advantage of, so there's less likelihood of revenge erupting later. Okay, one final note before I just give you a few how-tos in handling family law clients is the age-old question of how to tell which marriage counselor is good. The answer to that is twofold. One is that you'll just learn from experience dealing with a few people who is easiest to communicate with, and that just varies according to what lawyer is referring the case. And eventually people work out an informal way of working together. And I think that most of the family lawyers are quite informal with the marriage counselors, a very open relationship. And as I say, it really boils down to personalities. Some people swear by some counselors, others swear by others. What's good for some people is not good for others. The caution that I would like to mention is that curing a client is not the criterion by which to judge any counselor, because we're not magicians and nobody really gets cured. Some clients are simply so disturbed that no one can help them. And I'm sure a lot of you have had those in your offices too. Now, to the heart of the matter, which is what to do to get the client to seek help, and how to deal with those who won't follow through on the suggestion, and how to deal with your own feelings in response to emotionally demanding clients. I've already mentioned in several contexts that family law clients, by dint of the very nature of their legal problems, are different from other legal clients because of the emotional crisis. When in the state in which anger, depression, and frustration are their daily reality, even the most rational person becomes irrational and demanding. Their pain might be very obvious. They cry or they shout. They phone constantly. You know about that. But it also may be less obvious, and you need to learn how to read them. Less obvious is the pain of the client who withdraws into himself. It's really important to draw him out for his own mental health, but more important in order to help him clarify his legal goals in this process, so the process doesn't break down. The client who's angry but appears in complete control of himself on the surface is frequently in the most pain of all. It's important to remember that some of these angry clients are in pain because you don't feel like sympathizing with them, especially since you're bearing the brunt of a lot of their anger. Another client who rarely gets any sympathy is the one who chooses to leave the marriage, especially the one who is involved with a third party. He's often dealing with a great deal of pain and guilt as well around leaving children and hurting his spouse, and very few people sympathize with him. In addition to the emotional crisis which the client brings with him, the very fact of approaching a lawyer often brings up a whole set of problems because of the client's feeling of powerlessness. Even people who are in high positions in the community, professionals and so forth, are powerless when it comes to family law. They don't know anything about it, and they're in a totally new role. While the client needs the lawyer's authoritative knowledge, he may react by becoming very dependent on him or being very hostile about it. I've sat in lawyers' waiting rooms with clients and friends and have seen them literally shake because they know that that meeting will determine a great deal of the future of their own lives and those of their children. It's easy for people who are in lawyers' offices all the time to forget how terrifying this really can be. I should stress that I'm not expecting any of you to really be diagnosticians or counselors, but since clients come in contact with you first, you are the people who have to deal with some of these emotions, whether or not you would choose to do it. You really have no choice. Furthermore, an interesting study by some psychologists, Karkoff and Berenson, it's quite a famous piece of research. It's infamous among professional counselors because it doesn't look good for them. Indicates that the people who scored the highest on making real emotional contact with clients were not the trained counselors at all, but other people who came in contact with them, like secretaries, because they were more genuine. So your role is not to do therapy, but to try to establish rapport and create a supportive environment which will enhance the legal process. And many of you also, I understand, do a fair amount of interviewing clients as well. And here are some kind of basic how-tos for doing an interview with clients. Communication is the key to the entire process. The major underlying axiom is that you cannot not communicate. Whether you say, you don't have to open your mouth. The way you sit and present yourself and listen says a great deal to a client. One experience that I have to enjoy is that in my experiences being examined in examinations for discovery, and a couple of times on the stand, I've been examined by lawyers who felt hostile to me. Whether they were or not, I know they were just doing their job, but it feels scary. We're trying to discredit feelings. How do you measure feelings, they say? What does that mean? It doesn't have any meaning. What do you mean by nonverbal signals? And they were denying the importance of nonverbal clues. However, by their very behavior, watching their nonverbal clues, I knew exactly when they were coming in for the kill. And I was ready, you know. Okay, although people may be able to lie and manipulate with words, and by the way, I think a lot of the lying that goes on is not conscious, that people don't tell themselves the truth either. It's almost impossible to lie with your body, which is why sex is so often a very important indicator of problems in a marriage. Some people say they have a sexual problem. Almost never is it an actual sexual problem. I shouldn't say almost never. There obviously are sexual problems, but frequently, most often, it's an indicator that there are problems in other areas. And even though people are kidding each other or kidding themselves about their relationship, you can't lie with your body. So, in an interview, what's important is to look for postural clues, such as sitting hunched over, or if you see someone sort of with their arms crossed and their legs crossed, it's a very protective kind of stance, or a defiant posture, which is very obvious as well. Now, there are voluntary body movements which might suggest anger, and there are also involuntary body signs that clients can't control, like flushing, sweating, coughing, stuttering, that kind of thing. Another valid clue to nonverbal communication is the tone of the voice. It reminds me of there's an old nursery rhyme somewhere that part of it goes, "Come here," he sharply said, and the child cowered and wept. "Come here," he said, and the child looked and smiled, and straight to his lap he crept, something like that. But it's a very important point. The tone of the words and the pace at which it's spoken, how rapidly, how slowly, gives a lot of clues that sometimes I don't even listen to the content of what happens in my office. Sometimes when I have a couple in and I feel it's the same thing over and over, if I close my eyes, you can hear, you know. They have been going at this for 15 years. They've rehearsed it, you know. Sometimes if I actually close my eyes, I can get to the problem much more. The content simply gets in the way. Here are some interviewing skills which may sound too basic to mention, but I'll go through them rapidly because sometimes we don't think about them and they are very important in establishing rapport. First of all, it's vital to recognize that communication is a two-way street. I think we mentioned that. Even when you are listening in complete silence, your nonverbal clues tell the client a lot about you. And my favorite example of this was the first time I ever did any public speaking as a professional when I first came to Canada about 15 years ago, and I went to speak to a funding body for the agency I worked for. I was trying to get some money out of these women, and it turns out that they were quite elderly. In fact, it was the oldest group of fundraisers. The mean age was 85, and there were many that were older. And as I talked, I didn't get any response at all, and I found myself repeating and repeating. And I began to realize at that point that communication was a two-way street, because I wasn't getting anything back. I kept thinking something was wrong. When a few of them fell asleep, I knew I wasn't getting through to anything. It's pretty traumatic at the time. Okay, setting the scene for the interview is important. Physical comfort, taking the client's coat, making sure the light's not shining in his eyes, all these things give him the feeling that you care about his needs. The usual courtesies of greeting are so automatic that we scarcely are aware of their role in establishing communication. But it's important. Calling a client by name is quite important as a sign of respect. Looking directly at the client when you're listening to him is important. This may be difficult when you need to take careful notes or to fill in legal forms, but eye contact is of utmost importance in convincing the client that you're genuinely concerned about him. Give him your complete attention. Don't answer the phone while he's there. Show him you understand what he's saying by restating the major points of what he says in your own words. Ask him the kinds of questions which help him to clarify his own position for himself. When you don't understand, ask him to tell you about it. And don't jump to conclusions. Give the client time to think about answers to your questions. What I frequently did when I first started out, and I have to check myself on it now, is to immediately assume when a client brings in a problem that you might have dealt with in a different way. Oh, yes, I know. In fact, you don't know, because everyone deals with things in a very different manner. Don't let a long silence embarrass you. This often leads to, most of us tend to jump in and put words into the client's mouth which may not be there at all, and some clients are too shy to correct you. Begin the interview with as neutral a question as possible. I know this is difficult when you require certain information, but going the circuitous route is often the shortest when dealing with a family law client, because if you lead him where he's not ready to go, he'll lose his train of thought and or close off his real feelings. Note what he says first. That's frequently very significant. It's a clue to where he is emotionally. Resist the natural tendency to race in with support or to judge what he's saying. A non-committal response like I see or something like that will keep the door open. A more active response like tell me about it also will keep the door open. It depends on the client which response seems more appropriate. We all know that there are some clients that we can't get in a word edgewise, so we don't have to worry about that. Because communication exists on a nonverbal as well as a verbal level, your response to the client conveys much more to him than the content of your words. You're also sending very powerful messages. I think we've covered some of this before, so I'm going to skip over it. It's pretty clear that if you respond to a client's story by warning him or moralizing, that's pretty clear that he's going to shut down and not tell you anything. But what isn't clear, what very few people realize, is that praising him or agreeing with him can also shut down communication. Similarly, and this also may sound contradictory at first, even reassurance, sympathizing, consoling, and supporting can have the same negative effect on communication. Trying to make the client feel better, talking him out of his feelings, or denying the strength of his feelings, for instance, well, you'll feel better about that tomorrow, or don't worry, things will work out. That actually impedes the development of trust. The client then feels that you just don't understand how serious this really is. They feel that you don't recognize the extent of his pain. It's very important to keep ourselves from supporting and reassuring at the initial stages. The reason it's so difficult is that we as human beings respond emotionally to other people's pain, and we naturally want to make it go away. Not only so that he'll feel better, so that we'll feel better. It's very hard for us to deal with all the pressures that we are dealing with in this field. We must also resist the temptation to offer solutions to his problem, because in reality, there may well be no solutions. It's hard to believe until you actually test it out yourself, but simply recognizing the client's feelings help him immensely. Not doing anything about it, just accepting the fact that he has these feelings, even if they're very negative ones. By your indicating, by active listening, which I'll talk about next, you'll understand the extent of his feelings and accept them as valid for him to experience. That's not to say you agree with them or condone them, but you accept them. He feels vastly relieved. And the clearest example I ever had of active listening was when I was taking a course in parent effectiveness training, which is where I learned active listening. And at that time, it was years ago, I had 2 small children. And every night when I was putting the 2-year-old to bed, the 4-year-old would be complaining and angry and distracting. It was clear he was jealous. And I tried everything, distracting him with toys. Nice, why don't you go in the other room, I'll join you later, all that. None of it worked. And of course, every night I ended up yelling, screaming, and doing all the other things that mothers say they won't do and end up doing. Well, then I tried active listening. He would be banging on this toy piano, and I'd say, "Boy, you're really mad. You're really feeling mad." And he stopped dead in his tracks. This was different, a different response. And he said, "Yes, I hate Jennifer." So I gulped, and then said, I fought my natural impulse, which is to say, "You don't really hate your sister," and all those other things. And I said, "Boy, you are so mad at her that I bet you wish she weren't even around." He said, "That's right, I wish she were dead." And he got up and walked out of the room. I didn't say anything, I just nodded as if I understood. Obviously, I didn't think it was a wonderful thing, but I accepted it. He got up, he left the room, and I never had a problem with him at bedtime again. He just wanted me to accept how angry and how jealous he was. And that's the same thing that happens in the office, in any of your offices as well. In a legal situation, a client may say something negative about his own lawyer. Don't spring to his defense. You may get fired, but recognize the client's feelings of anger and frustration at the slow pace of the legal process, or his feelings that his client isn't interested in him. Telling the client that he isn't being patient enough and that it isn't the lawyer's fault irritate him more and creates hassles in the office. As an aside, don't let the client box you in with secrets. Establish the ground rules early so that tell him that you must share what he says with the lawyer. The very best way that I know of listening is called active listening, and just take 1 minute to explain to you. It really involves learning to decode a message that's sent by a client. Clients feel some emotional need and choose a certain code or way of expressing it. What often goes wrong in communication is that there is some misunderstanding on the part of the listener or the receiver of the message as to what the sender intends to send. It could be due to faulty sending, but the reason doesn't matter. Usually neither the sender of the message nor the receiver is aware that there is a difference between the message being sent and the message being received. That's why we get into arguments with people. We think they understand what we say. In fact, they don't hear it the way we say it. Or maybe we don't say it the way we think we say it. The way to check on the accuracy of your decoding is to feed back to the client what you hear him say. Not the content of what he says, but the feeling tone underneath it. In this way, you not only check out that you heard the message, but you also give the client a chance to clarify his feelings for himself. Don't feed back your opinion or evaluation or reassurance, just the feelings that you hear the client sending. For example, when a client calls and demands to speak to the lawyer immediately, if not sooner, a natural reaction, especially if this is the 3rd or 4th such call, might be to get a real edge in your voice and respond merely to the content of his message and to the surface anger that you hear. You might tell the client that the lawyer is in conference and that you'll give him the message. This only adds to the client's pressures and ultimately to yours, as he's likely to call back again and again and again. Instead, you might try active listening. For instance, saying, "You sound pretty upset." Most active listening responses start with you. You sound pretty upset. The client will feed back whether this is accurate. For instance, upset isn't the word. Frantic is more like it. You could respond to his feeling further by saying, you feel frustrated having to wait so long when you're feeling such pressure. Then the client feels understood and is more likely to believe on an emotional level that you will give the lawyer his real message and that the lawyer will get back to him as quickly as possible. It actually could be a shortcut, a way of stopping the onslaught of these calls. And now that we've all been so giving with our clients here, starting many of our sentences with "you must be feeling," how about how you, the legal secretary, must be feeling? How about the reality of being very pressured time-wise and work-wise and dealing with the tensions which inevitably arise in the process of working in an office? How about dealing with the personality of the lawyer, who in turn is reacting to his own pressures? How about dealing with our own moods and pressures from our own personal lives on any given day, which contribute to our ability or inability to be open to clients and to be responsive to their emotional needs? It's pretty hard to do active listening when you're feeling badly yourself for whatever reason. And how about the simple fact that clients who come to us are not equally likable, nor are they equally receptive to our helping efforts? In the effort to treat all clients equally and fairly, we may conceal from ourselves the differences in our own feelings towards different people. When we are unaware of these feelings, what I mean is there are some clients that we just hate. Did you ever meet someone and take an immediate hate to them? I mean, we all have that. It's due to holes in our own background, and it's a reality. When we are unaware of these feelings, we don't have conscious control of the expression of our own anger. If the feelings are strong, they will find expression. It'll come out somehow in devious ways, but the client will pick it up on an unconscious level. There's no way to not communicate. These negative feelings are just very natural. That's the first thing, is to accept the fact that we're all human and they are natural. The key to dealing with some of our own negative emotions is first and most importantly to become aware of them and to accept them as natural. We must look into ourselves before we respond to clients and be fully aware of our feelings in order to prevent them from damaging our relationship with clients. When you're feeling frazzled by repetitive phone calls and active listening has failed, you can send an I message, which is an honest description to the client of how you are feeling. For instance, I'm feeling under real pressure. Not from you, because if you use the word you, it's pointing a finger at the client. But simply under pressure. I am feeling under pressure because I have a lot of work to do and I keep being interrupted by phone calls. Not you interrupt me, but I keep being interrupted by phone calls, and I'm worried that I won't finish my work. That might give the client an idea of your feelings and a valid reason for them, rather than you're just pushing him away. The reason is you have work to do. You might add that you wish you could do something about the situation, but you can't, and will give the lawyer the message as soon as he comes in. Usually it works. Sometimes it doesn't, and those are the cases where no one can do anything. Well, time is running out. I'm sure I've overstayed my welcome. I'm sorry that I've sort of rambled on but I get pretty excited about the whole communication thing, and I was saying before to Ruth that it might be fun at some point to have a small group of legal secretaries and talk about it in more depth, about the cases that you deal with, something of that nature. I want to thank you for your attention at the end of a very demanding day and tell you that the nonverbal clues that I was getting from you indicate that you've been a very responsive audience. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Barbara, for your remarks. This brings to a close the program today. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I thank you all again for giving up a Saturday. And on your evaluation forms, what would also be helpful to us who work in continuing education would be some of your ideas of what kinds of programs you might find useful in the future. Thank you all again.
I